Hello, welcome to Social Value Matters 2020 and a particularly exciting session called Data Are Key, a fireside chat with Professor Kate Ruff and Carl H. Richter. My name's Ben Carpenter. I'm Chief Executive of Social Value International, and I'm going to be playing a very low-key moderator role in this session. I'm about to hand over soon to our speakers, but just a few words perhaps, just to set the scene. I'm really looking forward to this particular session. We've had sessions running continuously from 3 o'clock Canadian time on Monday. So I've lost track of how many hours that is, but we've literally gone around the world through time zones. And it's been a fascinating journey covering all sorts of topics relating to impact, social value, and how we tackle inequality and well-being. But today we're going to be talking about data, standards, impact, accounting. There's a whole host of topics here, right? It's all going to be mixed together. And I am so excited because Carl and Kate are two people that I've known for a while now, and they always inspire me. Their work is cutting edge, always gets me thinking. And I hope it leaves you inspired and thinking of a positive future. So without much further ado from me, I'm really going to sort of hand over. Just wanted to say, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we will be taking those as we go through. I think that's all the housekeeping done. So yeah, I'm going to light the fire, and over to you, Carl and Kate. Please introduce yourselves.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. So what I want to do is sort of start a conversation between Carl and I about data. And this isn't just like metrics, which is what we normally talk about when we talk about social impact. This is really thinking about data. So maybe, Carl, I was going to ask you about this big vision, but we should probably introduce ourselves. So why don't you start by saying who you are, and then maybe connect that to the Internet of Impact and some of the really cool work you've been doing with a group in China.
Yeah, that's a great way to start. So I'm Carl Richter. I wear a number of hats. The main one is a consulting company that I run called Engaged, and I've been working in the field of impact investing for about 10 years now, and always focusing somehow on data. Initially looking at financial performance data, increasingly looking at impact, and specifically trying to understand how we can get our data systems into a way that actually can work effectively with impact. I also wear another hat, which is in academia, where I lecture part-time at the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. And that's really interesting, bridging mainstream commercial finance and sustainable finance with what we're talking about here around impact and maybe much deeper, more intense issues and more personal for many people. And then I'm also an advisor to an organization called CASFI, which stands for the China Alliance for Social Value Investment. And they are moving incredibly quickly and have an assessment regime and rating effectively for mainstream listed stocks and securities in China. So what they do is they assess them in the same way that we have sustainability or ESG rating agencies or companies elsewhere in the world, and they then compile an index and a listing, a top 100 stocks that rank highly in terms of sustainability criteria, and they've already established an exchange traded fund. So really moving quickly, so people can then invest in those top 100. And
that's awesome. That's awesome. So tell us your big vision and how it connects.
So the big idea is you hit it already, which is the Internet of Impact, which is, I think, increasingly a shared vision. The words came together in a moment of frustration because we were, and I say we, because there was a fairly large working group that the OECD had assembled, and we were talking about data interoperability. And for geeks, and I classify myself as one, and hopefully a lot of people on the call are data geeks, we get really excited about interoperability. But for many people in business, they ask the question, well, why? What is good about interoperability, and why should I get excited about it? And so the idea of saying, well, we've got the Internet of Things, what about the internet of impact? You know, just think before the internet and think of how we imagine the future and how the future has arrived. It's totally different. So if we allow ourselves that freedom of saying, how different could the future be? What if? Then I think it's a term that kind of allows us that freedom of thought, you know. So what if, you know, if I'm choosing between tomatoes in a grocery store and I'm looking at 3 or 4 different boxes of tomatoes, how do I know which one is the most sustainable? And I might say, well, it's about the carbon footprint. And somebody else may say, I want to have gender equality in the supply chain. And somebody else may say fair wages and so forth. And we may all gravitate towards a different box of tomatoes. So how do we get that information? And what if somewhere, at some very far layer down below in the supply chain, changes their working practices or changes their energy supplier? Could we get that information real time? And I think we can. So we can sort of work towards that vision. But at the heart of it really is starting to focus on this as a data science challenge. And I know that's, Kate, where we have increasingly, you know, lots of conversations and really exciting conversations. And that's where I'm super inspired by the work you're doing with the Common Approach, which is really setting a lot of the foundation work for that. And
yeah, I'm definitely, as you can see from my backdrop, very excited to talk about what the Common Approach has done in terms of a common impact data standard. But you said it so clearly before, so I'm going to push you to try and spit it out for this audience the way you said it to me. You juxtaposed a data science approach from a more management consulting approach, thinking about how analysts and portfolio level people that are aggregating and comparing data, how they get that done currently and how it should be done. Can you just...
Yeah, so in my mind, I see that a little bit like a transition between, let's say, the era of fax machines and the era of email, where there's a paradigm shift. And when we bring that into impact assessment, currently, you know, a lot of it, and I'm maybe also leaning now from looking through the lens of the commercial investors, say, but there's a lot of surveys, there's a lot of self-reported information, there's a lot of analysts sitting pouring through documents, reports, a lot of them in different formats, PDFs, paper sometimes, desktop studies. People will go out to site. It's a very, very laborious exercise, and there's an opportunity for a paradigm shift which allows us to, in a way, almost invert the current process. And I'd like to, I think, later on touch on some of those things, but for me, that's it. I hope I've sort of hit the...
Perfect. Yeah, so I would like to take a moment to share with everyone what the Common Approach to Impact Measurement has done in terms of a data science approach. We have created, at the request of the Government of Canada, 4 standards, of which one is this Common Impact Data Standard. But I think this is the one that is the most exciting for people outside of Canada. And so permit me to share my screen and just tell you a little bit about what we've done. Carl, I'm looking at you. Can you nod that you're looking at a PowerPoint?
Yeah, it's sharing.
Great, thanks. So this is a hierarchy of data needs created by Monica Rogati. I cannot take credit for it. But what I want to highlight is up here. So we've got this really often what's called the sexy stuff, the AI, the deep learning. This is where everyone wants to get to. And then here we've got these analytics and metrics. And in the space of social impact reporting, sustainability reporting, a lot of effort is happening here. And what the hierarchy of needs is trying to communicate to us is that none of that works. It doesn't happen unless you've got these more fundamental pieces figured out. And the Common Impact Data Standard is way low down here. It is transformative, I believe, and important, but I also like to refer to it as 100 pages of boring. Like, if what gets you excited is social impact metrics, this, you look at it and you're like, it feels like nothing. But if we can get this adopted, this is where the data engineers and the data scientists get really excited, and we can do something quite transformative. So I like to try and communicate this to non-data scientists as an organization system for your impact data. So there's a place for everything and everything in its place. It's a way of specifying essentially a database that looks like a tool wall. Imagine it's just the shaded pictures of the tools. We don't provide the common impact data standard does not provide the metrics. It does not provide what the outcome framework. It does not provide baselines. It does provide a place to write that down, right? So it's to label it. And actually it's in a database, it's multidimensional. It's actually very complicated to put in an Excel spreadsheet because it's interlinked. But the key thing is we've taken the time to work with leading concepts of what is impact, using very closely with the IMP. We had an MOU with them and worked with them weekly for several months, unpacking all the data categories and elements of data. We combine that with lots of thinking from the not-for-profit evaluation world on causal chains, which are really important for understanding causality. And we've got a really good conception of what impact should look like that your data engineers are going to get excited about. It looks something like this, or even more boring. It's 100 pages that look an awful lot like this, just tables upon tables upon tables. It says there's a thing called outcome, and an outcome can have an indicator, and an indicator can have a description. Honestly, it is so boring and yet so transformative. And so the key thing here is that everybody who creates an impact database, anyone who's creating a software for impact measurement, who's creating their own bespoke tools for their own organization, has to tell their data engineers to create a structure. And the data engineers don't know impact. They don't know how to build the structure. And actually, even the people that are doing this impact measurement often haven't given it enough thought. So what we are offering to the world is, let us be your data engineer. We have put in 5-6 months of work. We've had our data scientists work closely with the impact experts, and we've got this really beautiful system that is at this very, very bland fundamental level of structured data. And what it allows is it's now making it possible for the sharing of information and the exchange of information. It creates the beginnings of aggregation, the beginnings of comparability, the beginnings of intelligent use of data, because the data is well organized and organized in a common way from system to system. I like to say it's a little bit like inviting your neighbor to go over and borrow a tool. They're gonna be able to find it. And if you don't have a common impact data system, it's like this picture down here. It's like, go borrow my tool, but good luck finding it, in which case it's so much work to use this data, no one does it. But if we can use a common impact data system, like our shared tool wall, we really set in motion some real possibility. And so that is like what I want to talk about today. And I really want to talk about how, because link this back to conversations Carl and I've had. Let me stop my share. Link this back to conversations Carl and I have about how this connects to broader principles. So it's not just about making it easier, but it relates to things like power and the distribution and owning of data, and having different people have different views of what matters in this world. So maybe, Carl, I can go back to you and you can talk about some of these issues of power and weighting and distribution and ownership of data, and how having a common impact data standard can get us to some of these more fundamental truths that we care about in the impact measurement space.
Yeah, and I'd like to work up to that. I'm very inspired, Kate, by your analogies and your images. I find they're always very evocative and great to get make the ideas very, very tangible. One idea that I often have in my mind, and I share with people, is the story of how we navigate a city. And today we'll navigate often a city using a smartphone, and we'll put in a search destination and the phone will figure out how to get there. It will search goodness knows how many different data sets out there, connect to an enormous number of different computer systems out there, and it'll tell you that based on the traffic congestion now, based on the fact that there's a railway strike or a train that's broken down, the best way to get from A to B is a bicycle or a tram or something like that. And the result will change based on real-time data, and it will change based on context and all sorts of other things. If you think about what's going on in the background, there's a lot of that boring stuff that Kate was talking about. You know, somebody has to work out how we get the telemetry off a bus and into your smartphone. And somebody else has to work out if the live information is not there. How can we then cross-reference to the bus timetable so that at least we can tell you how frequently it should have been there? And all of that has to be worked out. And at the heart of it is a fundamentally different approach, which is search-based, and it's the data science approach. And it's totally different to how we might have walked around a few years ago with a whole bunch of paper maps, looking at paper bus timetables, train timetables, and the like. And that's the kind of radical paradigm shift that we're talking about, which gets us to trying to explore what are these potential opportunities for empowerment. And so power is really an important thing, and to balance the asymmetries of power, and how do we then somehow create more democratization through data to create empowerment. And another area that I'm really inspired by are the principles that the First Nations in Canada have used for their data, which if people are aware, it's the OCAP principles, which stands for ownership, control, access, and possession of data. And they resonate so strongly. I keep using them as key principles that we should be using generally for our data, but generally also for our impact data. I think they hold true globally. And they're also linked to other trends that we're seeing. We're seeing and hearing lots of conversation around surveillance capitalism, where people are reflecting on what's going on with these large corporations that are scooping up all of our data and commercializing it. They're using very evocative language, comparing it to, colonial era exploitation of resources. People are using language around, comparing a lot of these large, particularly social media companies, comparing them to, the robber barons earlier on in industrial contexts. And I think what we see there is again, evidence of this paradigm shift that's happening. And in the same way that when paradigms shift really quickly, it takes us some time to evolve and get our systems in place so that we can take advantage of the new technology in a way that is also fair and distributed equally to people and fairly. So maybe there in that is the idea of distributed data. And why that's so important for me is because I think that aligns so closely and appropriately with the idea of what impact is. So for me, when I think about impact stories, I think about very, very personal stories, and they scattered around, and it's about all of our personal experiences and stakeholder engagement and identifying the stakeholder voice. These are lots of small stories that build up and collectively form a collage, a collective picture. And so how do we work with all of that, those distributed stories, and somehow extract out of that a coherent collective picture? So by definition, that's a distributed data challenge. And when we look at the systems that we're often presented with, computer systems, data systems, they tend to be centralized. And there's a radical misfit there. And so we can understand why those systems are like that, because it's easier for software developers, it's easier to build the infrastructure, it's easier to build the web apps. But at the end of the day, there's a misfit. And so I'm really inspired by a lot of the distributed technologies that are coming and arriving, particularly things that Sir Tim Berners-Lee is doing in terms of developing new web standards and web protocols. So really looking at re-democratizing the web, as it were, going back to the original ideas and tenets, as it were. And where we then go from that point is realizing, well, how do we avoid fragmentation? Because fragmentation is the bunch of tools just lying on the floor that Kate showed us, where we don't really know if what we're looking for is there. If it is there, we don't know where to find it, and all that kind of stuff. And at the heart of all of this is a concept called linked data, which really is a way of thinking about data rather than necessarily protocols and standards. Yes, there are those, but it's really about saying, changing again the paradigm from, if we think about storage, digital storage systems, we sometimes often have the idea of an electronic filing cabinet in our mind. So we put a whole bunch of data in a cabinet, that's our cabinet. And if somebody, would like access to the data, we make a copy of it, we share it, we give it to them, and off it goes, and it goes and finds its way into their electronic filing cabinet. And you do that a few times and you have a lot of replication and duplication, and it takes time to do that. And when you go to your filing cabinet and you pick up a piece of information, you don't really know if it's current or not, because you don't know if it's changed at source. So the idea of linking data just says, we never copy data. There's only really one original source of the data that has primacy, and access now means getting a link to that data. So if I put a piece of information into my data store, it may be something like a temperature reading in my apartment or something like that, or my pulse rate, or other biometric data. And I might then share that with my doctor. So they then have they have a link to that. And that means as soon as the data change, other people who have permission to access the data then get an update. And that's really the bit that unlocks the potential for real-time impact data. And when we overlay all these different elements of complexity that comes with impact, I think that's where there's a lot of promise.
Okay, I'm going to connect that to a few real life examples, like just building on what you said, and then I want to take Karim's question. So right now, we've got a scenario that you referred to where analysts, so for example, the group you're working with in China, say their name again.
CASV.
CASV wants to see a whole bunch of data. And in order to get data they can work with, they've had to kind of backward integrate down my pyramid with surveys to get people to answer questions on their terms, using their software in their way to collect it and use it. And that happens a lot right now, where funders require their fundees to fill out a particular PDF on a particular software or use a particular software. And they need to do that because they need to control that whole data pyramid in order to do the analysis and the analytics at the top. So I just want to connect all of what you said about distributed data to the possibility that if we have a common data standard, particularly if it's linked data, we have the possibility of organizations measuring what they think matters in the way they want to, using the software they want, measure once, record once, and then sharing is not re-keying in data, but authorizing access. And so it takes a huge burden off operating organizations. So that's one key point I wanted to make. The other key point I want to connect to that, Carl, building on what you said in terms of distributed data and OCAP. So OCAP is about ownership and control of the data. So that's where the distributed data comes in. But then the next is the power to decide what and how to measure. And you talked about having a good example of this with the organization you're working with, where they are taking similar metrics and at the analyst level, sorting out that those metrics are similar. But the different metrics or indicators are coming from organizations who are choosing their own measures, choosing to measure what matters most to them, and capturing through linked data the important details around that, the date, the method, etc., the specificity of the stakeholders. And when they share that data, this is what the Common Impact Data Standard supports. Each organization can say, okay, we're going to measure it this way. We're going to use estimates, or we're going to use survey, or we're using a telephone survey or in-person survey. And we collected it on June 10th. And we asked them about the last 12 months, or we asked them about the last calendar year. And we were asking about youth. And in our world, youth is age 14 to 20. And the geography is this. And all of that data can share to the funder so that the funder then doesn't have to define youth this way, collect the data on this day, ask about the last calendar year, not the last 12 months. The funder is just left with the mess of trying to figure out how to compare all that, but the power has been shifted to the organizations. So I think what I've done is given some concrete examples of everything you just said. Would you agree, or would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, maybe follow up on some of the things that inspires, because you know, I think at the heart of that is the work that the Common Approach is doing and you're doing, which is really at the cutting edge of how do we extract key signals. You mentioned an example where organizations would measure impact based on metrics and indicators that are relevant and specific for them. And that's a really important starting point, because we often have funders and investors that may want to report different things, other things. Or they might want to, you know, they require other comparative data. And it's so important to realize that because impact is happening at the level of often the organization or the impact creator, that we really need to start with impact metrics that work for the organization that's actually managing the activity. And then the usual next step is to say, okay, well, if an investor wants something else or a funder wants something else, you know, they're providing the capital, so I have to then provide a whole different set of reporting. And then we start this process of, you know, running multiple different systems alongside each other reluctantly, and there's total resource fatigue as a result of that. And what I find so inspiring about Kate, the work you're doing and the Common Approach team, is you're looking at saying, how can we actually then extract really, really important signals that you know, that might be a little bit more generic, a little bit more commonplace, but as a result of that, they are more comparable because we can extract a signal out. And I know you were talking a little bit previously on some of our conversations now, probably quite a few years ago, in terms of, you know, how you'd be able to extract information out of, say, a nutritional indicator, and different people have been measuring different things, but yet we can all extract information out there to see how that's reporting or relevant to the Sustainable Development Goal relating to ending hunger. I don't know if you want to touch on that, or maybe.
I might follow the questions a bit, if that's
okay.
What do you think?
Yeah, sure.
So,
I haven't been able to keep track of them. Yeah.
Yeah, Krim's asked a really great question about monetizing versus public commons. And this is something the Common Approach has a thesis on, and something I have a personal sort of thesis on, the line between what is out there for the world to use for free, that it's common, and what is market this. And I'm wondering, maybe I'll offer my answer from the perspective of the Common Approach, but then Carl, I know you look at, you know, the MIT data pods and some other ways of thinking about this, so perhaps push back. My feeling is that the Common Impact Data Standard, or some data standard that is a competing data standard that emerges, it really doesn't have to be the Common Approaches, but we need one. This should be free. It is like HTML. It is like, I'm trying to think of something else that it's like, we need it to interface with each other, and we all gain tremendously by that interface. But there's no real secret sauce or magic to the Common Impact Data Standard. So what we are trying to, besides a lot of hard work in the background, but what we envision is that softwares would take this, and then their secret sauce, the thing that they can market or monetize, is how they make the data collection and the data input user-friendly, how they target to different types of organizations. Are they targeting the small organization with half a person doing impact measurement? Or are they targeting an organization that has 7 different projects, each with their own impact measurement person, and you need levels of reporting? For example, like you have different user interfaces. You can also build analytics in unique ways that the Common Approach data standard does not build. So I think the making money and the marketing and the monetizing is in how to make this user-friendly, how to make it accessible and targeted to different users, and how to really beef up the analytics, again, for different users. An investor, a grant maker, and a manager of a networked organization, and a manager of a small organization are all gonna have different data analytic needs. The Common Approach does not, the Common Impact Data Standard does not go there. That is up to the market to solve. What we make possible is that each of those different bodies can use any software and press send, or Excel, frankly, we have an Excel version of it, and press send, and it gets incorporated into the analysis that this other software is used. So we've really worked on reducing the data redundancy and made it possible to collect, have a place for everything and everything is place. So that's like the person recording the data knows what date they recorded that indicator. And rather than being in some long text field, it's got a place for it to go. And that can then, if they have the information, it can move with the data. What would you say about monetizing and common goods, Carl?
There's so much here that is so important. It's important for impact data. It's also important in the context of how the web is evolving and the lessons we're learning about how currently, web organizations like Google or Facebook and so forth develop their business models. So maybe let's approach this in a few ways, because there's the funding and there's the monetization of the core infrastructure. That's one piece. Then we can work through the bits of software in between, and we can also talk about impact data itself. And there'll be lots of different views on that. But if we start maybe right at the beginning, it's all around ideas and ways of thinking. And that's where, we need the ideas out there as a commons, because we need everyone to latch onto the ideas and share them and add to them and create a normative approach. So we all actually are orientated in the same way. And then there's the next level, which is, the way people are talking about the internet now as almost access to the web is almost like a human right. It's like it's essential in the same way that water is essential, or other, housing and having a good home and so forth. And so if having access, to impact data could be argued as being that important fundamentally, not necessarily being able to get your hands on it, but being able to have the ecosystem there that can distribute impact data that effectively, then equally, it's a public good that could and should be seen at the level of public infrastructure. And there are a number of different ways of funding that, and public sector funding, is one, foundation funding is the other, like we see with Wikipedia and the Linux Foundation, leveraging, the benefit of open source development and so forth. And I think that's really important, because if we make it clear that there's a certain piece that is always going to be a public good and is always going to be non-profit, and is if there's any money involved, it's only going to be there to cover costs so that it doesn't require permanent subsidy, then I think we also see a lot of technical folk, software developers, being prepared to also put effort in and co-develop and co-own and co-shape this. And so if there's a piece missing, like if there's a piece missing with Linux, you just build it and you submit it, and there's an approval process, and then it becomes part of the package. And sometimes corporate organizations, Siemens or Samsung or whatever, say, well, hey, we would like a certain piece of functionality and we don't have time to wait for somebody to develop it. Can we actually fund that? And so therefore they fund the Linux Foundation to develop certain things. So then we can start seeing how the business model of that element can work. What's really important then is to very consciously realize that if that is effectively a natural monopoly, it has to be separated from the layer of software provision, where maybe it is appropriate for commercial vendors, for-profit vendors, just to be producing different workflows that have an edge, and where, if it saves cost and time and effort, then quite rightly companies can be expected to pay for that, because there's a cost benefit that's quite tangible. So in a way, this is creating market opportunity for software vendors as much as it's creating a public good, and with an appropriate level of delineation. And then I want to touch on the idea of impact data, and let's go right in there and talk about monetizing impact and the different views of that. And we know from the different instruments, the financial instruments like social impact bonds and the like, that there's a lot of movement in that direction. We know that a lot of people warm to the idea of being able to communicate impact through some sort of monetary valuation. But let's talk about actually buying and selling the impact data itself. At what point is that good? At what point is that right? At what point is that inappropriate? And I think what really excites me about the broader movement around distributed data and the next generation of the web protocols that Tim Berners-Lee and others are promoting is it allows people to actually choose. So currently, if our data are sitting on a Facebook server or a Google server, we have absolutely no idea how much or how little of those data are being shared with advertisers or other parties. And we can go back to the really early days of the web where people like, I think it was it Ted Newton was talking about micropayments and talking about the idea of, you know, a highly, very granular web of linked data. So talking about linked data decades ago. And so these are not new concepts, but I think in a way the world has had to work towards this point, and realizing that to get linked data to work and be able to, you know, let's maybe make it a little bit tangible. The idea of linked data would be, and how would that differ from the web as we know it at the moment? The web is really a store of documents. So imagine a spreadsheet, an Excel file or a spreadsheet file that's sitting there as a chunk, and that's a website. And you can address that whole document. But now that spreadsheet has a number of different sheets in it, and it has a number of different cells. And what we're talking about here is being able to address every single one of those cells, those boxes in an Excel sheet, and saying, well, I want to get access to these 3 cells in Kate's spreadsheet, and I want to also get access to these 3 cells or 2 cells in Ben's sheet, and then for all of my other friends and whatever. And I might have, you know, a whole host of these connections out there, and getting access to those different data points. And some of them may be free because we're friends and we'll share information, but others might be, I don't know, a stock market ticker or something like that. And we may not want to get the full bucket of information that that provider is making available. We just want to get one piece of information. So,
Carl, just wrap that up, because I think you're really close to a question we've had in the chat. So keep going with monetization. I think you've got it. But I want to see if you can take that directly to privacy and ownership and privacy around that data. And I want to say the common approaches philosophy on that, but also would like to hear how, with all this linking, so the question was, with all this linking, aren't there data privacy issues? So maybe as you finish monetization, connect into privacy.
Yeah. So, so to some degree, that was finishing really close to the end of the monetization, because the idea of micropayments means that you know, we as owners of our data can choose what price we want to put on our data. So that's really starting to get us into the whole privacy issue. But let's take a step back, because a lot of this is you know, privacy by design. It's data sovereignty by design. It's just eliminating the problem. So, you know, currently we think of the data sharing regulations that are out there, GDPR being one of them, and they're there to try and almost get the horse back into the stable after it's bolted. And the idea with distributed data is, because you never move the data away from your, let's say, data pod or data storage device, you simply don't have to worry about other organizations losing the data. And because they don't necessarily have a copy of it unnecessarily, you don't have to worry about them sharing it with other people. So these issues of data privacy and data sovereignty tend to then happen by design, because you know, you have full control and ownership of your data, and fundamentally you're separating out where the data are stored from the software service that is connecting to it. So currently, again, we've, you know, using the Facebook example because it's so commonplace and people are familiar with it, you can't use their service without your data being on their system, and you have no choice where it's stored. Whereas with distributed data and data pods, you choose where you want your data stored, and you separate that decision from the service. And if you no longer are happy with the service, you change the service provider. And so it also changes the social dynamic. It changes the relationship of trust and power, exactly, and the social contract. So suddenly they're not going to abuse the data if that means you have almost zero friction to change service provider.
So I'm just going to pop in there with what the Common Impact Data Standard does around this, and then I want to shift to some questions about how this might relate to charities as opposed to businesses and impact investors. The Common Impact Data Standard, as I mentioned earlier on the call, is this very low base standardization around the representation of impact data. And then we are offering softwares to adopt it. We have a document that is not quite done. It's been like a day or two away from being done for about 3 weeks, but very close to being done, that talks about what softwares need to commit to say that they're aligned with this and to the degree to which they need to adopt it. And one piece of that is data governance. So it is recording with the data what the deal the initial recorder has with the user. So the question in the chat from Anjani was about personal data. The claim was impact is finally at the individual level, which I'm not sure is always true. I think we can talk about community level impact, we can talk about environmental impact, but a lot of impact does come down to individuals. So I will agree that there's a good chunk of it that is individual. And so when that individual data is recorded and aggregated, then the deal with the individual that has been struck has to be part of that recording so that when the data is shared, it is shared in a fair, consistent way. Typically, when we are talking about aggregation of impact data in the context that I'm working, we're actually, the aggregation has already left, like what is being shared is an aggregated version. So an indicator about number of people or number of jobs or amount of people feeling more hopeful. Like these kinds of statistics, often you wouldn't share the underlying individual data, you'd share the aggregate, but also that this aggregate data has permission to be shared with the individual. I hope that answers Anjani's question. There was a question, Carl, about how this might relate to charities. So well, let's go with this. Do you see impact value? How often do you see impact value changing? And how often do you think impact data would need to be updated? Does it need to be live, dynamic, etc.? And how might this, how does impact data, talk a bit more about that. You mentioned it briefly, but come back to it. And if you can do so in the context of charity, that'd be awesome.
So maybe let's start setting a scene relating maybe to the idea of social services or personal services. And I see Jenny Inglis is on the call, so I'll do a shout out because we were on a discussion today, and what I'm about to say picks up a storyline that she developed for that session. But we can imagine service providers, so I'm thinking of charities in that context, or social enterprises, social purpose organizations, where they might have very, very personal interactions with people. And so on the one hand, you might want to record things like life satisfaction, you might want to record very personal health information, you might want to know all sorts of bits of information to be able to piece together a picture. So health records, movement, geospatial information, all sorts of things. And of course we know that that information can be abused. And if that information gets into the wrong hands, then those people who are extremely vulnerable can ultimately become victims of something else, some other nefarious activity. So we're back to a situation where on the one hand, having access to incredibly granular information, just think of your Alexa or whatever device you have, listening to every single conversation that you have. You don't really want that information to be sitting on every single computer server that's around. So where I see really, really exciting potential, and there are a few organizations working on it, is to move forward on top of the idea of these data pods. So this is something that I'm talking about a lot, using the language of data pods, which is picking up the language that Tim Berners-Lee is using. And I saw you posted a link to the Solid project, which is how they're packaging it. And the idea of a data pod is simply to say, this is a place where I store my data. It could be a thumb drive, it could be my mobile phone, it could be my server in my living room, it could be a place in a data center somewhere that I'm using, but it's my personal space. And currently, if we imagine, say, a social service provider, or let's expand that a bit, a health insurance company, if they wanted to do some analysis on us, we would have to send them the data, and it would then sit on their server, and then they would have to analyze it. Whereas with data pods, what they can do is they can send an algorithm into your data pod, and they can then crunch the data and extract the result, the kind of signal that Kate was talking about there, the anonymized result, you know, the what is the result of the computation, you know. So it might just be simply a yes no answer, you know. Was somebody's temperature within normal range? Did somebody exercise enough, you know, that kind of information. And because we can extract, because we end up just extracting the result that can be anonymized, and the algorithm can be made open source and totally transparent, so we know exactly what it's sending back, we have the opportunity of being able to work with much more granular data that we would never ever be prepared to send to the health insurance company because it's so personal, but we can allow the algorithm to run on it because we're comfortable and confident and have trust in the fact that that information is staying in my data pod, and only the result is going away. So I hope that addresses the point in the context that
absolutely
shaping. Yeah.
So there's one more question I want to pick up in the chat. It was a really great one about that shifting to supply chains, and this is from Patrick. You know, what would happen in traceability and value chains, for example, tracking sustainability characteristics and batches of cocoa, living income, deforestation, etc. And Carl, I'll let you talk about what that might be like in terms of the Internet of Impact, and maybe even if it relates to data pods or the kind of bounded flexibility work you're seeing, and I've forgotten their acronym again, the group out of China.
CHASV, yeah.
Thank you, CHASV. But I'll briefly talk about it with relation to the Common Impact Data Standard. So the common approach, which is the project, has 4 standards, of which one is the Common Impact Data Standard. And it is naked. There is no there. There is what Patrick has suggested is a bunch of sort of indicators or topics that would need to be tracked. And all the Common Impact Data Standard does is provide a place to list your indicators or your topics, right? So it's just structuring the data, but it doesn't have any framework of indicators. So the answer is yes and no. Yes, it is the guts, the framework. If you were to create a system that could trace all this stuff, you would need a database and a software. And we have a data standard that can help you build that. If you need all these indicators to help track these specific things, now I need you to turn to another type of standard. I just finished a session on the complementarity of all the different impact standards that are out there. It feels overwhelming to many people, but they're all doing slightly different things. And this is a great illustration of how the Common Impact Data Standard stops and another standard picks up. So you could use the common, and would need to use some kind of framework, or some kind of data structure, and I would recommend the Common Impact Data Standard, to combine with a GRI or an IRIS or a bespoke framework that could do the kinds of things that Patrick is asking for. But none of that content. I always say that the Common Impact Data Standard is like this tool wall, but you got to bring your own tools. So what you've listed is a bunch of tools you would need for a project. You got to bring those. The Common Impact Data Standard doesn't offer that. Do you want to talk about how different approaches to data might support that, Carl? We've got 4 more minutes. Okay.
So I think I also want to go back to the point about supply chains, because I think that's you know, it's quite interesting. It's a very different example to the one we're talking about with social services or personal social services and the like. And hopefully it really gives another angle or aspect to the point you raised there, Kate. And I know from discussions with Patrick a little bit about the context he's working in. But if we think about, you know, the supply chain of something simple like a bottle of beer, because in theory it has you know, 3 ingredients, but then when you add the brewing, the bottling, the cap, you know, shipping it somewhere, the restaurant that might serve it to you, the recycling, before you know it, you've got quite a few organizations that are all having some sort of impact. And if we look at the most, let's say, commonplace impact indicator that people are talking about at the moment, it's carbon emissions. So it's not at all at the level of depth that I know a lot of, Kate, your work is focusing on. But I think it's a really good example of just showing how challenging that one issue is, which is a science-based target. So in theory, you would say, well, it should be quite simple because it's a quantitative data point that we're trying to get. We're not, there's very little, let's say, value judgment that we are asking for people to provide. We want to know exactly what is the carbon footprint. And, it takes companies up to 3 years to calculate a full Scope 3 report, which is looking across the entire supply chain. So the combination of, and wrapping up in the answer, in the combination of linked data, distributed data pods across the supply chain, a layer of common interoperability standards, which Kate is talking about, gives us a common infrastructure that will allow us to imagine, everyone in that supply chain having a data pod with their own contribution of carbon in that, and allowing the purchaser of that bottle of beer to interrogate that entire supply chain and get the answer in real time. And if somebody, today changes their tractor from a diesel tractor to an electric tractor, tomorrow when you scan that bottle of beer, you'll get a different answer because of all the stuff that we've been talking about today.
Okay, Carl, I love talking with you always. In
Likewise.
3 minutes or less, I just want to try and do some summaries. So we talked about a mix of vision and like things that we want to create and things we're moving toward and things that are ready today and actionable. So data pods is something that you are creating, and how much can an organization pick up and be like, I'm doing data pods now, Carl? Is this like ready to go technology or ready to start designing technology?
It's ready to start joining the team and working on it.
Right.
And so, this is to some degree, the language that I'm using is what I'm picking up from what Tim Berners-Lee is doing. So that's where the real sort of powerhouse is, and the reason for following that is really because it's an extension of the web. So that means it's a common set of protocols. So the reality is, to try and have an exciting discussion like we're having today, we're talking about the things in the future, a little bit sort of near
Well,
sight.
I was going to clarify the difference, but the Common Impact Data Standard not being in the future. It being ready today. There being softwares using it today. It can be an exchange language today. Starting today, it can help to flip the power between funders and operating organizations to minimize the burden of reporting and help support the infrastructure that will allow operating charities or businesses to articulate their own vision of what matters, their close attention to stakeholders and those whose lives are most affected, which is something dear to Social Value International and something dear to my heart. So I want to really focus on that being like, today, start now, go do it. And then this vision of what it can create and what's coming, which I think you have prepared for us. Is that fair to summarize in our parting 1 minute?
Yeah, and I suppose the bits that we're working on are around trying to operationalize the data pods and the linked data that are being developed as generic solutions. And what we're realizing is one of the key things, one of the challenges that we need to do is resolve, for example, search. We spoke about supply chains. It's about how do we find information that we think is out there, but we don't necessarily know it is out there. So the answer to your earlier question was, yeah, this is happening right now.
And then we're just looking at our notes. Ben, can I have 40 more seconds? Or no? Yes. Just looking at our notes and some things we wanted to touch on, we wanted to talk about how a radical rethink of our data structure, so things like the Common Impact Data Standard and data pods, allow polyvocal accounts. And this is something also dear to my heart and dear to something Carl thinks about. But this is the idea that there's not a single answer to what matters and what is valuable and what is the impact of an organization. Different viewers and lenses on that organization have valid and different takes on how good this organization is based on their different priorities and that kind of thing. And if we take a different approach to data, we can give more voice to people whose lives are most affected to articulate what in my field we call the counter accounts or the polyvocal accounts, in addition to the more standardized GRI, FASB, IFRS, SASB type accounts. So we need both, but we want to add a new story in. And I'm going to leave that as our transformative punchline and go to Ben.
You knew that was a punchline that I would be cheering on, Kate. So thank you for that. It's a very important point. And wow, what an incredible session. So thank you. First of all, thank you both, Carl and Kate, for a really wonderful tour of some of these issues. But I do think that we have just started scratching the surface on some of these issues. I think we need to spend more time exploring the things that are ready today, like Kate says, the common data standard, and the work that you're doing, Carl, which is ready, and you're looking for volunteers, I know. So what I'd like to say is that thank you for everyone who's joined today. Your contributions show how engaged you are in this topic. As Chief Exec of SVI, I'd like to keep this conversation going. So we will make sure that we have another session like this in the next few months. And perhaps we can get emails and think about what the next topic should be to chunk off and tackle together. Is that a plan? Kate, are you up for it? Carl, are you up for it?
Definitely up for it. Always good fun.
All right, fantastic. So everybody, thanks again. This is going to be brought to a close now, this session, and I'm going to invite you all to jump over to another Zoom link if you've still got it in you for the final close of Social Value Matters 2020, the Leadership Dialogues. So yeah, I hope you can join us for a mini celebration and a call to action. Thanks, everyone.